in our panel now. Please join me in welcoming Susanne Eichhorn to the stage. Now she's in-house lawyer at Deutsche Telekom. Welcome, Susanne, as well. And you see Ulrich Kelber is still with us, and of course Peter. Peter, true that there was a slight audio, signal from your end, but I think our audience could get everything you wanted to get across. If there are any questions, the audience, please do not hesitate to put anything you want to know or you didn't quite get in the chat. We'll come back to that later. So what I got from what Ulrich Kelber told us, and also what Peter just mentioned, is that there are a lot of developments going on already. We do have the GDPR environment, and we have had that for nearly 5 years now, and we've seen developments in many other countries and continents as well. So maybe Mr. Kelber, because you're probably the most familiar with the GDPR framework and all the harmonization that is going on, also on the DPR level. Do you think that GDPR can be or is already basically the blueprint for the developments in other countries? And could that be developed into something bigger, so into a global framework, or do we need some changes as well on the global stage?
So the GDPR is a kind of the blueprint for a number of countries, but it will not be a global framework for everyone. There has to be a multilateral approach, which gives room for a number of data protection regimes. That was very easy to see on the G7 Data Protection Authority Summit this month. And that's not really a problematic situation from the point of view from data protection authorities. So there are a number of countries like the US, Brazil, Japan, Korea, Argentina, India, really adopt some of the basic principles like data minimization, FTC paper, or purpose binding or purpose limitation, and this gives room to a number of decisions by the European Union. So on the European side of things, we have a data free flow with all G7 member countries and beyond. But we see developments like in Asia, or we have countries which implement both frameworks, like Japan or Canada or the US, and we have to set a high standard from that common understanding, maybe taking some of the principles of GDPR. We have to look out for interoperability between these frameworks and for convergence of standards, not only for governmental access to data, but even for some basic understanding of the regulation of the private sector too. And then we really have a common situation with different regimes for having that flow of data with trust. You always repeat idiom the Japanese government in 2019 for its initiative.
Perfect. I see we did have two questions regarding your keynote earlier. I'll try to circle back to those at the end of the panel as well, because I think especially the Cloud Act discussion needs some further details maybe. But before we do that, Susanne, we did hear that the GDPR is or might be the blueprint for other developments around the globe. A lot of privacy law frameworks do take aspects of the GDPR. So I think it's always important that we do reflect on what we have as well, because if it's a blueprint later, then it should be a good one. Do you think the GDPR in its current state is a functioning framework? And seeing that you've had to implement the rules for nearly 5 years now, are there maybe some things that you think should be changed for Europe, or especially in other countries that are still developing their frameworks?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I must admit that it's a bit hard for me to understand because I have always the echo with me, but nevertheless, I try. Hope that the audience can hear better. From the practical perspective, I think the GDPR is a really successful story. We have the moment, as you know, as a very large European telco company. Do you hear me twice or just? No, okay, it's okay. As a very large European telco company, we have a couple of European subsidiaries. And to give you an example, we implemented and we want to, in the future, some IT platforms which acts and works for all European companies we have in place for the telco companies. And it's no surprise, it's very easy to implement it when you have just one legislation you have to consider too. And this makes lives much easier. That's the big advantage of the GDPR, of the European-wide legislation we have in place. The only challenge remaining for this background are the different interpretations of the European authorities. I know that they are trying to align, but sometimes we have still differences, and this is what it makes a bit complicated at the moment. Beyond European borders, as you may know, we have also companies outside EU. We have the problem we had before GDPR. We have to look at different legislations. If we would like to implement worldwide platforms, we would have the same problem as we had before GDPR. But as we have heard, it's not so easy to implement the same legislation for the whole world. I think we have to deal with this in the future as well. But coming back to GDPR, I think this is a really good story and we can work very good with it. And I think it's not because you asked for the improvements or what to do with the global approach. It's not only about these practical issues, having or it's being easier to implement worldwide, European-wide platform. It's also about this idea of trust in us as a company, as a data processing company, because I think this is really crucial for GDPR and for the data processing in Europe, that our customers can trust in the data processing according to GDPR. And I think this is really a good thing, which should be exported and spread it out to the rest of the world. And coming back to possible improvements, I think we talked about Schrems 2, and I hope that there will show up a solution within the next future, because this is really not solvable by us as companies. We have worldwide and good solutions with US service providers, for example. We want to use it, and I think there must be a solution to do so. And if I can mention one wish regarding improvement, I think it's not about the GDPR itself as a regulation. Sometimes it's about the interpretation, which is rather practical than dogmatic, so to say. Sometimes I have the impression that the customer has to be protected for him or herself. And I think we should have a more practical approach also for the acceptance of the customers to this data protection issues.
I think that's a very, very good wish, and I absolutely get what you mean by that. But and I also think the aspect of trust in the data processing itself, but also in you as a company and the framework as a whole is of the utmost importance as well, especially if we want to drive innovation with digital tools. And seeing that you, Peter, are the expert for global digital tools, basically, I would be very interested to hear your view on especially maybe the differences you see in the US framework and the European framework, and the changes that have been started on the US side regarding data protection. Where do you think that is going? Will that help, especially regarding EU-US transfers, or will there be new requirements even?
Yeah, Rebekka. First, just a little comment maybe for the tech support. I think we're hearing a lot of echoes, so I don't know if there's anything that people could do to kind of minimize the echoes that some of us are hearing. But on the US, what I'm seeing is convergence. The theme is convergence. I'm seeing convergence between privacy laws around the world. When we operate our services, we try to operate under one standard worldwide. That standard is increasingly basically the GDPR standard, and that's in the United States as well. When you look at the privacy laws that are being passed in places like California, they look a lot like the GDPR now. When you look at the privacy laws being passed in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, they're heavily inspired, in some cases they're almost copies of the GDPR. If you ask companies what they care about in any field of regulation, they'll say, give us one clear, stable set of rules, and then we'll comply with them. Don't change the rules every year. Don't give us 100 different inconsistent rules. There's been a lot of critiques inside Europe about the GDPR. But I would remind people that the GDPR was meant to be a very long-lived, evergreen legislation. The directive had been in place for 20 years. I think there was an expectation the GDPR would be in place for 20 years. It's been a huge investment of money and people to bring companies like Google into compliance with what everything that the GDPR demands that we do. We've done that now. And then we're doing it worldwide. So I would go after stability in this field so that people can invest the time and money in the compliance programs to live up to these principles. And while we're never going to get to one privacy law, if you will, it's adopted in every country around the world, that's just not how the world works. We are getting to a convergence of privacy principles, at least at the corporate levels, because we're running global businesses. We have to do that.
Absolutely. I think the aspect of stability is coming up more and more as we see more and more regulation being developed or already in the market, especially in the digital economy. But stability also leads me back to this whole harmonization aspect. As Susanne, you mentioned that it's extremely difficult to follow rules if they're interpreted differently, especially by the data protection authorities, because we do always look what they are saying at the end of the day. So, Mr. Kelber, as you are actively involved also in the EDPB efforts, what do you say the harmonization efforts and the interpretation stability is going well, or is there some room for improvement, and where?
There's always room for improvement, and especially here. I think the larger part of the problem is not a real ongoing different interpretation, but a room of uncertainty on the first harmonized interpretation of several problems. And as with every new regime and regulation is coming in, it took some time to have certain decisions on basic principles, have a common understanding of that, not only among data protection authorities, but all stakeholders in that part. So it's on the enforcement and decision on strategic cases. And yes, the GDPR had a very slow start on the enforcement on cross-border cases and big tech at all. I think there's light in, or hopeful light at that point. So the number of draft petitions are rising, and we established the so-called Vienna process in the beginning of this year. That means that the EDP as a board identifies cases. So not only on transparency, like the first draft decisions you see on the large cross-border cases, but on the very basic question of legal basis for protecting, how far interest can reach, and points like that. And in these cases, we have time limits and support each other to have quick draft decisions, but then really prepare the floor for having that decision transferred to other new cases. So the harmonized interpretation of new questions has more framework where all stakeholders can really have common understanding and safe floor below their feet. So I think yes, there is. We are getting better, and with improvement, there's the need for pressure to hold the speed of that improvement.
Mm. Yeah, I absolutely get that point. I think nearly 5 years after the GDPR entered into force, I think we did expect a much faster rollout regarding the harmonization and binding guidelines and so on. But I think it's also natural, and Peter, you mentioned that the GDPR was made to stay, and it's such a large regulatory framework that it is kind of understandable that it's still difficult to implement it, and there are of course practical questions. But I do also think that we all need to work on making it better and making it more functioning. And also one aspect to achieve that might be not only trying to adhere to all the rules in the process and the technology we do have today, but develop new technology that might be better at preserving privacy. Peter, we do call that privacy preserving tech, and I know that you've always been on the forefront regarding that. So do you think that might also be a way, so not change the regulatory environment, but really changing the tech itself?
Yeah, thank you, Rebekka. Look, we've been talking about laws, but laws are only one pillar that drive good privacy practices. Technology is another, and technology doesn't have nationality. Technology is by definition global. So if we're talking about driving global privacy practices, technology, in my mind, is an essential pillar to this. When I think about privacy preserving technologies, I'm thinking about tools, platforms that allow us to do things, both Google, industry, and around the world, in ways that we learn from data, build interesting data-based services while living up to privacy principles. For example, there are a whole array of techniques and technologies that are being developed. Some of them are already in widespread use. Processing data locally on your device rather than sending everything up to a server. Differential privacy, which is a mathematical model that inserts noise into large data sets so that individuals can no longer be identified. Federated learning, where machines divide up the task about learning what people do into lots of individual little bytes at individual levels, and only combine up the learnings rather than the inputs that individual human beings have done, like how to spell or misspell a word in a language in the world. Those are privacy-enhancing technologies that can be implemented by anyone, everywhere. Obviously, they're tools for privacy. I would almost caution against putting too much weight on the purely legal debates. The laws are, of course, essential frameworks and set out the obligations, but they're general by nature. They have to be. And technology companies, mine and others, can contribute tools that I think will actually help live up to the principles that these laws articulate. I can't even imagine a near future where controllers will be expected to say what privacy enhancing technologies am I using as part of a DPIA. Regulators looking at controllers to say what privacy enhancing technologies we're using. And the need for this will increase dramatically as we move increasingly into the world of machine learning, where machine learn from data. So the use of these tools will be an essential prerequisite to enable that revolution to continue to unfold while living up to these privacy principles.
Yeah, innovation in that regard as well. And I, for myself, I'm quite excited to see whether technology will also solve some of the legal issues that we do have and that we will have for quite some time. Because if that works, then it will be a true functioning framework. We have talked a lot about, of course, about the GDPR and the data protection frameworks and environment. But Susanne, for you, it's always more than just the data protection and privacy requirements, because you, as a telecommunications company, do have to adhere to a lot of other additional rules as well. And maybe just to complete the picture, do we have the same issues there? Is there also a lot of different rules in different countries, or is there already some harmonization? What could be done better on that end as well? Because I'm asking because data protection and communication merges together more and more, and the regulation should too, at least in my opinion. Would be interesting to hear how the current framework works.
Luckily, there are not so many other rules and laws to be considered. To start with Germany, or also with the others, but we have this new TTDSG, this Telecommunication and Telemedia Data Act from the end of last year. Now we have a kind of alignment when it comes to contract data. So that means regarding contract data or what is not metadata, I think the same rules apply as for all the others, and this is a kind of harmonization in the market, which is good for us. Nevertheless, as you said, there are special rules to be obeyed when it comes to our special services, and I think there's nobody who wants who is not willing to observe the telecommunication secrecy, for example. This is our special service we provide, and this is what we are keen on safeguarding. Nevertheless, I think there are some ideas to provide cross-border services as well, and there we have the same situation as we had it before GDPR started. Means we have several rules, regulations in the countries, and that's the reason why we are waiting for the privacy directive. I think around about 5 or 6 years so far. And yes, it's still needed to create a harmonized level of regulation also in this telco market. And I think we are a very innovative market and companies, so it needs to have some regulations which make it possible. For example, this further processing, compatible processing, as we have it in the GDPR. It should also apply for e-privacy directive. This is one of our wishes, because there are some use cases we can cover with this, or could cover with this, when it comes in force, and it should come into force. Yes, so we need also here, or we would prefer a cross-border regulation, also cross-border one-stop shop authority for cross-border projects. This would also be a good thing. And I think for the time being, the Telecommunications Act in Germany also applies now for others than the so-called old-fashioned telcos, also for the OTTs. They have to observe telecommunication secrecy, for example, as well. And I think this is a matter of harmonization as well at the moment. Yes, it's in the law right now, but frankly speaking, I think there are some who are not aware of this in the extent it should be applied. So this is room for improvement, but in the end, yes, cross-border regulation would be good as well. That's the reason for e-privacy, what we are expecting with the privacy.
I'm really curious to see if or when we'll see the e-privacy regulation to be finished at the first stage and then enter into force. Because for all of you who follow the dossier, you know the first proposal is from January 2017. And we are talking today, it's September 2022, and the regulation is not done. I would dare to say that technology has somewhat passed what was laid down in the old regulation. So maybe it needs some additional overhaul to enable what you just mentioned, Susanne, a functioning framework also for the telecommunications sector and for all new players that are active in the market. So yeah, we'll see if we see the privacy regulation to be finished next year. I for one, I'm quite glad that we had the opportunity to talk about such a wide variety of topics and regulations and ideas regarding data protection today and with you. I would like to come back to one of the audience questions. We do have at least 1 minute left, and I promised the audience that I would always try to include that as well. So I think, Mr. Kelber, it's mainly a question for you because it's regarding the Cloud Act, and our audience member wants to know if there will be a bilateral agreement with the Cloud Act, aren't we then even better protected than we are now? Do you see that happening?
So the first thing will be the transatlantic data protection agreement. To really have a proportional governmental access on data on both sides of the Atlantic, and the chances for citizens to for remedies on that. The idea of the U.S. government to have bilateral agreements on the U.S. cloud itself is a question to the political side, not to the authorities. The only thing we are afraid of would be the idea of having bilateral agreements which each individual EU member states, instead of having a bilateral agreement with the EU as a whole. That could give ground to some really strange situations within the EU. So I don't think that there will be a reaction like that from EU countries, at least not from the EU Parliament. As a second step, it would be necessary to have that common understanding of governmental access, which is needed for the work of government organizations.
Okay, I think the point you just mentioned regarding there shouldn't be a lot of bilateral agreements with each and every one of the EU member states is absolutely, it's fundamental, and it also brings us back to this whole harmonization thing that we basically talked about for the past hour. Thank you so much for answering at least one of the questions. We'll try to come back to the other one later. To you, Peter, Susanne, and Mr. Kelber, thank you also for agreeing to discuss the Global Data Protection Framework with me today on our stage. I hope we talk again soon. But for now, thanks and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.